colleagues, please join me in welcoming the discussants for today's dialogue. Up to the stage we have Jack Kimani. Jack is the CEO of the Climate Action Platform for Africa, or COP28, as you may have heard it called, and David Ashiagbor, who is the Chief Financial Sector Strategy Officer with the African Development Bank Group. Thank you. No? Oh, great. So I won't spend too long introducing this session, but we all know how much climate change is becoming one of the biggest challenges that's facing humanity today, and we all know that these global environment threats are coming at us faster and more frequently than ever. This is really urging us to accelerate the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and the development of higher resilience to safeguard the most vulnerable regions. And climate mitigation and adaptation are really vital notions that have to be mainstreamed and embedded within the financial sector to respond to the regional needs that we have. There's a massive opportunity to leverage the fact that both COP27 and 28 are in the MENA region, and acknowledge that COP27 was billed as the Africa COP. I know that the language of sustainable finance is terribly based on acronyms, and I'm a firm believer that there's no sort of stupid questions in the world. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands what COP is, because people talk about it. It is the conference of the parties, and many UN agreements, conventions, and treaties have COPs. But funnily enough, for climate, COP has become such a widely known term across the world and with the general public. It all goes back to the signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change back at Rio in 1992, and the first COP was in 1995. And you probably all know the most famous of the COPs was COP21 in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed. It has 198 parties to the convention, but over the years, increasingly COPs have become more and more important, not just for the parties or the state actors, but also for the non-state actors. So for civil society and for corporates and for the general public that are interested in climate change. So that's just a little background. And in this dialogue session, what we're going to do is look at mechanisms where, state actors and non-state actors can be actively engaging, particularly from the finance industry, to increase the sector's contribution to climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. So we're going to look at the expectations for COP28 and start by looking back at COP27 and think also about what the road ahead looks like. So coming to Jack first, could you tell us a little bit about COP28 and what it hopes to achieve?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Very glad to be here and to be part of this very important conversation. So COP28, Climate Action Platform for Africa, is a public benefit system orchestrator, field builder, focusing on industries around viable climate action opportunities on the continent. And it's important, the focus on the continent. I'll be getting to that in a minute. We work very closely with decision makers like yourselves who are in the room, policymakers, and the inclusion of non-state actors is a critical part of the solution that is needed to solve for this crisis. And we focus along the chain of identifying, quantifying, prioritizing, and ultimately realizing viable climate action opportunities that can act as engines for economic growth, viable, sustainable, inclusive economic growth that also can be the basis for job creation within the continent. If we don't marry the two, where we look at the solutions to the climate crisis being at odds with what we need as a continent towards achieving our own development agenda, I don't think we'll get too far. Now, the good news is there isn't too much of a daylight between what is required to solve for the crisis and what we require for our own development. And the reason why is because we have particular competitive and comparative advantages as a continent that make us very compelling to provide the solution that the rest of the world is looking for to solve for the climate crisis. Now, that's not what you hear in a lot of these convenings, including the COP, but I hope we can have a conversation around what are these assets that Africa has, and some of those include a superabundance of high-yield renewable energy potential with limited competing use. And the limited competing use is an important aspect of this, because you could argue for the developed world, for the global north countries, were they to tap into renewable energy, the priority should be to displace the emitting sources that they already have. In our case, we don't have an old economy that we need to be displacing anything. We can deploy this immediately to the green economies of the future. Then you think about the availability of natural resources, huge large endowments within the continent, and then couple that with a growing young workforce. And that combination essentially speaks to a very compelling case for us as a continent to be able to meet the demands of what the world needs to reach its own climate goals. And not only just do that, but also solve our own development goals. And so being able to address the twin crisis of our own growth as a continent, improving the livelihoods of our people, but then solving for the climate crisis. And there's a number of ways as CAP-A we feel you can deploy these assets. One of those is thinking around first, how do you shift our own consumption, our own demand for goods and services to be anchored on the new green technologies of the future, allowing that we are not increasing our already sort of low emissions profile, and so being able to meet our own demand within the continent, then being able to apply that green manufacturing capacity to meet the global demands for goods and services. Onshoring, reshoring, some of that production that is already taking place elsewhere with higher emitting sources, reshoring it within the continent, enabling us to tap into this renewable energy potential. And then last but not least, being able to revamp and essentially take to scale the ability for the continent to provide a solution towards carbon removals, from both reforestation to engineer solution and anything between. And that becoming sort of an anchor, again, not just for the global solution that is needed to solve for the climate crisis, but again for our own development agenda. So this is to submit to us that policymakers, as much as we would like for them to care about climate change, as much as we would like for them to be concerned with what the world requires to solve for the crisis, they really don't need to focus on that. I haven't had a policymaker who wasn't ridden into office on the basis of job creation, economic growth. If that is what incentivizes them, let's focus on that. But in the process, though, in implementing those new green technologies, implementing those opportunities, then we'll also be solving for what the global community needs to solve for the crisis.
Thank you, Jack. I think that builds very well on what we heard on the last panel about it not being a zero-sum game and there being so many win-wins here. David, please, could you tell us a little bit about the types of things that you're doing at the African Development Bank in relation to climate?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, thanks, Sarah, and also thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I think in line with what has been said already, the African Development Bank sees climate as very central to everything that we do. In fact, it's one of the 2 pillars of our 10-year strategy, which is all about promoting inclusive and green growth on the continent. And the objective is really, as Jack has said, to ensure that development on the continent brings about growth that is not only economically empowering, but also decarbonized, climate-friendly, environmentally sustainable, and socially inclusive. So we don't actually put climate in a little box. where it's something special that we do on a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon. A lot of the work that we're doing is actually mainstreaming it across all our operations. Having said that, I'm just going to give a couple of examples of some of our main programs that are focused on climate. I think first thing is that we made a commitment, the bank made a commitment to provide 40% of our total financing to climate. We exceeded that target last year. We are now at 45% of our total investment, which is counted as climate finance. Also, 63% of total climate finance goes to adaptation. And for those of you who are interested in targets and that kind of thing, that exceeds a global target of 50%, which means that we are actually a global leader on climate adaptation. We have the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, together with the Global Center on Adaptation, through which we are aiming to mobilize 25 billion for climate adaptation, and thinking about, the specific audience of financial sector stakeholders here. We are also working on the African Alliance for Climate, Africa Financial Alliance, for climate change, which will really be an umbrella organization bringing together all financial sector stakeholders to work through climate finance issues from an African financial sector point of view, with two objectives, really. First of all, to understand where the African financial sector is. And I know we've heard, we have a great number of leaders in that field in the room today, but also thinking about some of the smaller institutions and the smaller countries who we also need to work with, and who also need to adapt and be able to seize the opportunities and manage the risks associated with climate change. How do we help them? How do we work with institutions like, our hosts today, UNEP, FI, GCA, GFANS, et cetera, et cetera. I think I'll stop there. I think, there'll be further opportunities to talk a bit more about our work as the session goes on. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Thank you. And Jack, so did COP27 kind of live up to its promise of being the African COP? What were the kind of the key takeaways that are crucial for Africa that you took away?
Yeah, it was also dubbed the implementation COP. And, excuse me, there will be varying, obviously, responses to whether it met the expectations or not. There were two key items to my eyes, two key breakthroughs that emerged from this. Some historical breakthroughs, you could argue, towards global climate collaboration on what is required for the world to move forward. And one of those was the establishment of a fund for loss and damage to assist vulnerable countries that obviously are most impacted by climate change. And the next one, and it's quite important, was a call to structural reforms to the international financial infrastructure in a way that it can be more responsive to the climate emergency. These are key, important breakthrough outcomes, I think, from COP27. And it's not to be wished away, the importance of being able to see traction on those. But I would argue that we still did not see the scale of ambition that is required to meet the moment. When you talk about the impacts of climate change, we did still need to see more being done. There were really no significant steps being taken, for instance, to curb emissions that came out of the COP27. And this is aligned with the Paris Agreement of trying to keep peak warming below 1.5 degrees. If without being able to have any significant steps being taken in terms of emissions reduction, I don't know how then we can be able to see a pathway towards where we need to get. And this is again where as a continent, we need to be looking at what do we need to be contributing? How do we need to be engaging in this conversation? For the longest time, and now we're going to COP28, and we need to be pausing and asking, so 28 times we have been at this conversation, what do we have to show for it in a very tangible, real way? And given the impact that we are confronted with, especially as a continent where through no fault of our own, you know, the paradox of having the least, being the least contributors to this crisis, but being the most impacted. How do we need to reorient our thinking in a way that we're not just seen as victims, we're not just seen as bystanders who just need to deal with the consequences of this crisis, but we can also proactively provide a solution to it. A solution that is aligning, again, with our own agenda. An agenda that is meant to improve the livelihoods of our people and be able to reach middle income status. And that's where the conversation, I feel, needs to start moving towards, and allowing that Africa can be able to be at the table when these solutions are being discussed. I think part of the challenge is that you know, the global community sees where we are at with some of the planetary boundaries that we are kind of inching towards in terms of you know, climate goals and the ambition that has been set in terms of reducing our emissions. And I think there's hesitancy to see Africa getting to where it needs to get to, because the traditional way of growth is such that your emissions go up as you get rich. Then at the point when perhaps you've reached a certain GDP per capita, then you start looking at, all right, how do we decarbonize? How do we reduce our emissions? And most of the times, you don't see countries being successfully in that. Most countries will offshore some of that manufacturing elsewhere. So the reduction really at a global level is not coming down. It's just that you have now sent those emissions in another location. And there's this fear, this is not expressed this way, but I believe implicit in some of the conversation, there is fear. If Africa was to pursue its own development agenda, if Africa was to grow, then the amount of emissions that would result in would compromise on the net zero targets. So what does that mean? Should Africa just remain poor, keep its emissions irrelevant in a way that does not compromise on what the rest of the world needs? Of course, that's not attainable. It's not a morally acceptable position for us. But then the question is, then what do you do? And I submitted that there is a pathway Africa can be able to develop, not just with a net zero development pathway, but a net negative development pathway. Because if our emissions are already negligible, are low, and we can be able to adopt, and I hate the term, but leapfrog to the green technologies of the future that don't add to the emissions, but then in addition to that, be able to layer on abilities to be able to remove carbon, the net effect of that is essentially being able to grow with a net negative development pathway that not only helps in achieving our own ambition again, but also in carrying the burden of a lot of these old economies that will be very difficult for them to decarbonize. I think where we are right now is most countries are going to miss their net zero targets. I think that's a reality of the situation. And there are countries that cannot even be able to get on that net zero trajectory until way later. And what Africa can do is provide a solution to that. We will carry that burden, not for free. We can carry that burden, and in carrying that burden, also solve for our own ambition.
Great. So COP28 is all about really taking charge and seizing that opportunity for the clean development that we need to see. David, what are your hopes for COP28? You know, obviously it's a massive boon that it's in the Africa and Middle East region again. Obviously the host country being UAE and so heavily oil and gas dependent is something that's been discussed a lot in the media. But, you know, what's the kind of narrative arc that you're hoping to see develop coming out of COP27 and into 28?
I think I'm very much aligned with the points that Jack has just made. I think with respect to Africa, it's time to make Africa's voice heard. Heard in a number of ways first of all, about the impacts of climate change on our continent. I know, like Jack said, we've said it 27 times. We need to say 28, maybe 30 times. Let's keep let's keep saying it. Second point is there's a general perception out there that Africa is not aware of climate change, that Africa is not doing enough about climate change, if anything at all. I think that narrative needs to change. So Africa needs to go to COP28 with a strong voice across all sectors, not just finance. I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussions around, the just transition and Africa's role in that. I think we need to go with a very strong voice across all sectors. The third point is, I think we need to go with, I would say, a climate positive narrative, which is, and that picks up on the point that Jack was making about, the conversation does not need to be about just Africa's contribution to net zero. It's about how can Africa contribute to solving this global crisis, which gets into the discussions around the natural assets, the carbon sinks. Are those being accounted for, so that we can actually have a proper discussion about Africa's role, the opportunities, the risks as well. But as I say, I think we've had enough of the doom and gloom. Let's focus a bit more on the positives and how Africa can actually make a positive contribution to resolving this global crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Coming more really specifically into the role of the financial sector, obviously at Glasgow in 2021, the real kind of driving force there was pledges, with the launch of GFANs and in unprecedented levels, financial institutions pledged to commit to 1.5. Then I guess the year of 2022 was really all about actually setting the targets that are going to help that pledge to be achieved. And then this year, I think, the focus is really on transition planning and financial institutions developing robust transition plans. And obviously, we have the global stocktake coming up, which is really going to be highlighting the gap. So we are vanishingly running out of time, unfortunately. So maybe just in 1 minute each, could you talk a little bit about, why the COP process is important for financial institutions and how financial institutions can kind of make the best out of it and how they can really engage to advance the global sustainability agenda?
Thank you. Yeah, I think if we can reorient some of these conversations around the opportunities that enable that the solutions that we are seeking, we can find financial viability in those solutions. We can be able to find not just, again, obviously, financial viability, but also providing a solution towards the crisis. And then moving beyond that to look at what are the enablers, what are the levers. I feel sometimes part of the challenge is in when we focus on one topic, it leaves us remiss to question the trade-offs, to question the synergies. So climate finance, for instance, is an enabler. And we need to think of it within the context of, okay, what is it enabling? And what is that opportunity in a way that it can be quite compelling for us to be able to overcome some of the risks that obviously we need to be addressing, some of the concerns we need to be addressing. And so again, it's not to ignore those risks, but to view them through the opportunity lens. And in doing so, creating the motivation, creating the drive for us to enable that we can be at least motivated towards finding out what those solutions are. And I think, importantly, for the financial institution community is also being able to engage in a way that some of the traditional ways we have viewed some of these concepts, some of the traditional ways that we have approached this space. How can we enable ourselves to be more enlightened? And I'm thinking, for instance, you know, when you think about carbon markets and things like that, are there pointed instruments that could be developed that enable the placement of capital being tied with access to carbon revenues, and having a forward-leaning posture to helping in addressing this from the standpoint of finance?
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, if we think of, you know, people always say the private sector is the engine of growth. It's the private sector that drives the economy. And I always say, well, if the private sector is the engine of growth, the financial sector is the fuel that keeps that engine running, right? So in a way, what the financial sector actually does is it determines where the resources go. So we're not going to get a decarbonized economy, we're not going to get green growth if the financial sector is not seeing how to direct resources to those sectors, to those areas in an efficient way. So I work with the African financial sector, right? And I think that for the African financial sector, it is really important that we begin to understand everything that happens at the COPs, what the processes are, what those regulations that are coming now to mean. How do you translate them down to your level, whether you are running, you know, a big regional institution like Standard Bank, or whether you're running a small local bank in Chad or Guinea-Bissau or any of our smaller countries, because that is where the change will happen. So I think we really need to, again, as I've said, look at it both from the opportunities perspective, but also at the risks, but also begin to think about what these regulations will mean for us and what we need to do to adapt, and the support we need to do to adapt, so that, because otherwise the solutions that are going to come up are not going to be applicable to the African context. And then, you know, worst case scenario, you potentially end up in situations like we had with the anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism, KYC regulations, where you end up with a set of international regulations which many African institutions or countries just do not have the capacity to apply, and then it becomes a barrier to access to finance. So instead of actually solving a problem and enabling development, you've created another barrier, and that's something that we need to avoid at all costs. Thank you.
Thank you. I love your analogy of you know, the economy being the engine and the financial sector being the fuel. And if I can just maybe build on that, I think many of the members that we have within the Net Zero Banking Alliance kind of see the risk of being kind of left at the altar by governments not creating the right enabling policy environment. So I would encourage all the governments, when they're thinking about NDCs, etc., to kind of think about providing the right safety and other policies, like, you know, the equivalent in the analogy of MOTs, road tax, and all of that kind of infrastructure. So it's vitally important, and as you say, that regulation is not implemented in a way that's going to be overly burdensome and actually stop people being able to take those opportunities. So I think, unfortunately, we are out of time. I would love to hear more from you guys, but we've got to catch up on time. So please do join me with a massive, sustainable round of applause for Jack and David. Thank you.